Hi, my name is Angela Huffman. I'm an APQS dealer and an educator with the APQS Long Arms for Lifelong Learning Center. The APQS Quilt Path tutorials were designed so that you can follow along with your own Quilt Path system. I encourage you to click what I click and to pause, rewind, and rewatch as often as you need. Most importantly, though, please know that the system was designed so that there are many ways to accomplish the same thing. I will show you the way that I like best, but that doesn't mean that there aren't other ways to do the same thing. So I encourage you to play with your Quilt Path system. I encourage you to make a lot of mistakes. That's often the best way to learn. It's really easy to get started with Quilt Path once you have it installed. To turn on Quilt Path, first flip the power switch on the carriage. Next, turn on your APQS machine and make sure the belt clamps are engaged. Finally, power up your tablet and start the Quilt Path software by double tapping the Quilt Path logo. Upon startup, the system will go through a series of brief tests, and the machine will move toward the belly bar just a bit. Be sure to position your machine away from the belly bar during startup. This is the main menu. You'll note that there are 3 menus on this home screen. On the left is Design and Create. In the middle is Select and Sew. On the right is the Print menu. We will talk about each of these menus in time, but right now, let's look at how simple it is to sew out custom quilting block motifs. We will tap on the Pattern button in the Select and Sew menu. You'll notice there is also a Pattern button in the Design and Create menu. You'll use that button when you want to make a motif from scratch. For this lesson, we'll be using a design motif made by a professional designer. Once you click the Patterns button, you'll be taken to the Pattern selection screen. Let's get familiar with this screen. On the top left side, you'll see the file tree or location of the folder we are viewing. Reading from left to right, we are in the C drive of your tablet, in the QuiltCAD folder, in the Patterns folder, in the Continuous Line folder. This is the viewing window. We can see the patterns that are in the Continuous Line folder. If I tap on the Block button, now I can see all the block motifs in Quilt Path. Look up at the file tree. Do you see that now we are in the C drive, in the QuiltCAD folder, in the Patterns folder as before, but now it says Block, to show that we are, in fact, looking inside our block folder. If I tap on the corner folder under the file tree navigator, it will change accordingly. We also have a quad and a triangle folder inside the Patterns folder. If you touch the large arrow keys on the right of the screen, you can move down to the next page of triangle patterns. To navigate back to the first screen, just touch the up arrow. Let's find a block motif to stitch out. We can do this 2 different ways. If we know the name of the pattern we want, we can filter the files for the name or even the first letter of the pattern. Just make sure the File Filtering button has a green check mark. If it doesn't, just tap it to check the box. Next, tap in the search box and a keyboard will pop up. If there are any letters in the entry window, just tap your cursor so it is at the end of the letters, and then tap the backspace button to remove them. Now tap in F and L and tap Enter. Quilt Path shows us all the patterns that start with the letters FL within the Blocks folder. Notice that if I tap on the Continuous Line folder, I will be shown all the patterns in that folder that start with FL. You can tap in as many letters as you'd like in the search box. If we wanted to open one of these patterns, we'd just tap on it once to highlight it and then tap Open. However, before we do that, let's look at a second way to select a pattern. Let's bring up the keyboard again by tapping in the input box and tap on Clear and X out of the keyboard. Now we can once again see all of our patterns. Make sure you're in the Blocks folder and tap on the arrows on the right to scroll down through the pages of patterns until you see the pattern called Flower Point. Notice that the patterns are in alphabetical order. To open this pattern, you can either double tap on the motif or simply tap once to highlight the pattern and then tap on Open. At this point, Quilt Path may ask you to define the safe area on your table. It wants to know where it is allowed to sew, so it needs to know where your leveler bar, belly bar, and table legs are located. Move your machine to the uppermost left side of the table and click the top left button. Now move your machine to the lowermost right corner of your table and click the lower right button. You have now set your safe area so Quilt Path knows where it is allowed to stitch on your table. You'll then be taken to the placement screen. Here is where you'll size and place the motif. There are many ways to place a pattern within a block. Let's take a look at our choices for placement. You can either click the info box on the right or the settings button up top. This is the settings menu, and we have some powerful choices here. This is where we can fine-tune our pattern and machine. On the left, we can select the speed we wish to use to stitch out our motif. Quilt Path runs the machine with the incredible APQS stitch regulator engaged, so our stitch quality will be wonderful. I prefer to keep the speed here to slow for dense patterns and medium for more open designs. I like my tie-off stitch count to be about a 4. This refers to how many stay stitches the machine will take automatically at the beginning of a motif. I like to have both of these boxes checked. You can make your own choices, but let's be sure the Pause at Trim Lines button is checked. The next portion of this panel gives us control over the padding we want to leave around our block motif. It is always a good idea to build in a little fudge factor around a motif. That way, if you have a wonky seam in your quilt, the motif you are sewing won't careen into it. By pressing the plus or minus buttons, we can gradually adjust the extra padding we want to compensate for any irregularities in the piecing. You can also adjust the horizontal or just the vertical spaces with the arrow keys. The reset key will always bring you back to 0 padding. Let's set the extra padding to 3/8 inch on all sides. Quilt Path can also stitch out the ditch around your block. Keep in mind that we're talking about a human making the ditch and a computer stitching it. Chances are good that my ditch isn't perfectly square. A good way to compensate is to ask Quilt Path to stitch 1/8 inch inside our block. The end result will be more like an echo inside the ditch, but it will still look nice. If you'd like to truly stitch in your actual ditch, we will show how to do that with Quilt Path in a later tutorial. In the far right section, we can determine which placement method we want to use to drop in our motif in our block. We will cover all of these methods in time, but for now, select 4 points and stretch. Now, click OK. Quilt Path is now asking us to show it 4 points so it can adjust or stretch our motif to fit. Move the machine to the upper left corner of the block on your quilt top. Tap the corresponding placement button. Move the machine to the upper right corner of your block on your quilt top. Tap the corresponding placement button. Bottom right corner and tap. Bottom left corner and tap. Over in the specification box, it shows the size and width of our motif. Quilt Path has skewed the block to fit in the space we have on our quilt top. If the block on our quilt isn't perfectly square, that's okay. Quilt Path will make the needed corrections so you don't have to worry about it. Quilt Path sizes the motif to fit the space. Of course, if you wanted the pattern to fit inside your block without stretching, we would have selected Fit inside the settings menu instead of Stretch. In this case, my block is pretty close to square, so the slight stretch provided by Quilt Path will look natural as it fills the block I have, so I'm going to change it back to stretch. Let's sew it. Tap the Pull Bobbin button and Quilt Path will move to the start point. Take a single stitch and move away. On the screen, you are directed to pull up your bobbin thread and press sew. If your machine didn't pull the bobbin thread, click on Settings and make sure there's a check beside Automatic Bobbin Pull. Press OK and then press Redo. You might also need to redo if your bobbin tail wasn't long enough for the top thread to pull it to the top side of your quilt sandwich. Hold on to the tails and press Sew. Quilt Path will move to the start and take the number of tie-off stitches you had selected in the settings menu. Notice on the screen that the pattern turns dark blue, showing you where Quilt Path has finished stitching. The light blue lines are where Quilt Path is about to stitch. When it is done stitching, you can either return to the placement window or head back to the main menu by clicking the red X. If we head back to the placement menu, we could stitch our ditch by selecting the Pattern Ditch button to toggle it to ditch. Now Quilt Path would stitch out the boundary of the square that we clicked in using our machine, and depending on the margin we selected in the Settings menu, it will determine where Quilt Path will stitch around the block. Have you noticed the Trace button yet? If you touch that button, Quilt Path will move the machine, but it won't take any stitches. This is a good way to make a trial run of a pattern if you feel squeamish about placement. The toolbox icon allows us to reset our safe area, move to the start point of a pattern, take a single stitch, or release the carriage for basic manual control, so we can move the machine more easily. The repair button is used when we have a thread break or our bobbin runs out and we need to restitch a portion of our pattern. We'll cover how easy it is to use this button in a later lesson.